So, thank you very much for coming. First of all, before I start, we're going to be recording tonight's talk event, and there will be there's a photographer that you might have already seen who's taking photos for us tonight. I hope this is okay with everybody. So welcome to our discussion panel tonight with UN Special Rapporteur Joe Cannataci. We called this panel is Privacy at Risk in Germany. I think a lot of us would say yes, but we want to know why. This is a joint event of Gesellschaft für Freiheitsrechte, GFF, the Society for Civil Rights, in cooperation with Reporters Without Borders, and I'm also welcoming you tonight on behalf of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, in short HIIG, an institute that researches the development of the internet from a societal perspective, so thank you very much for hosting us tonight. My name is Nora Margaret. I am a vice president and founding member of GFF, and I'm a junior professor for public law, international law, and global constitutionalism at the University of Hamburg. It's my pleasure to chair the panel tonight. So I will now briefly introduce the two sort of host organizations and also our guests, and then we'll start with two short inputs and a small round of questions on the panel before we're going to open up the discussion for your questions. And of course, there will then be more time for questions and discussions over a glass of wine or a glass of juice. So briefly, who's inviting you for this panel tonight? The Gesellschaft für Freiheitsrechte, GFF, was founded about 3 years ago as an organization to protect civil and human rights in Germany through strategic litigation, and especially in the areas of privacy, freedom of information in the press. Sorry, I'm looking down, so I'm not going to talk too long. And freedom from discrimination. And Reporters Without Borders is an organization that documents violations of freedom of the press and freedom of information worldwide and raises awareness where journalists and their staff are at risk. They also fight for better safety and protection of journalists against censorship, both online and offline. Both organizations are represented on the panel tonight, but first let me introduce our special guest, Professor Joe Cannataci. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. We're very happy that we were able to secure you at such short notice tonight. At the end of your 2-week visit to Germany, I take it that you're leaving tomorrow and you're working on the report right now, so thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us tonight and to share your impressions with us. Now, from left to right on my side, we have Buermeyer. He's the president and co-founder of GFF, and he's also a judge and currently a clerk at the Berlin Constitutional Court. On my immediate left, Christian Mier. He's a journalist, a human rights activist, and an expert on international media politics since 2012. He's been the managing director of Reporters Without Borders in Germany. And last but not least, our host tonight, Professor Jeanette Othman. She's professor of internet politics at Freie Universität Berlin here in Berlin. And she's the director of this institute where we are tonight, the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. She's also a researcher at the WZB on global governance, internet regulation, and digital change. So much for introductions, and we'll start the evening off with a short input by Joe Cannataci on his visit to Germany. And I think you have your own microphone if you'd like to use this one. Thank you.
So good evening, everybody. It's very good to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to all the members of the panel, organizations, individuals. Well, I only have one problem. I've been given 7 to 10 minutes, and that's a dual problem for me. Firstly, when I start talking about privacy, it's difficult to get me stopped. And secondly, when I talk about privacy in Germany, it's even more difficult to get me stopped because Germany is a place that I've always loved. It's a place where I feel comfortable. It's a place where I've been coming to since 1983, so that's 35 years now. And I'm a much happier man because, the first time I came to Berlin in 1983, you couldn't walk down Unter den Linden or Friedrichstraße the way you do today. And that's, I suspect, why I do what I do, right? Because we have to remember that the first time I came to Berlin, the Stasi had established a ratio of roughly 1 spy for every 6.5 people. Now think about it. This is the principle of ubiquity, right? And we're in an internet institute. And one of the questions which lies at the foundation of what we're doing is privacy at risk, especially because of the technologies that we carry? Now, some people are using smartphones in my directions, other people have bigger lenses, but okay, hands up all those of you who have a smartphone. Okay, perhaps I should change that. Hands up anybody who does not have a smartphone. Okay, 3, right? 4. So actually that's a bigger percentage than we normally have in the room, right? And so what should I tell you in such a short time about my visit to Germany? Right? Things have been going well for Germany in privacy since just before the first time I came here, especially because we got, in 1983, we got the census decision, we got an articulation of the right to personality, and from Persönlichkeitsrecht, we moved to informational self-determination, and then by 2008, we got the right to digital online privacy. The court in Karlsruhe has been quite a strong defender and developer of the right to privacy. And those are good foundations to build on. And some improvements have been made recently, right? So I can imagine that if I say, you've all followed what's been happening since the Snowden revelations, and you say, so what's been happening in Germany since the Snowden revelations, right? And this is the point where, instead of speaking for 75 minutes about everything that is good in Germany, so can we say that I've just spoken for 75 minutes about everything that is good in Germany, right? There's a whole load of good, right? But has everything been going well for the past 5 years? No. Have some good things been done? Yes. So let's look at a few of the good things which have been done over the past 5 years since June 2013, when Edward Snowden made his first revelations. 1, we now finally have a Federal Data Protection Commissioner which is no longer part of the Ministry of the Interior, but which is independent. That's a good thing. We now have a bigger budget for that outfit, right? Today, there are 3 times as many people in Arbeitsgruppe 22, which looks after the police and intelligence, but 3 times as many is only 3 times 6, right? So we're at 18. Now ask yourself the question, are 18 people enough to monitor the Federal Criminal Police, the Federal Internal Domestic Intelligence Service, and anything else which they are not excluded from? Yes, I said that carefully, because the Federal Data Protection Commissioner is excluded from doing some things because the Germans thought that somebody else could do it. You also have moved forward in terms of, so there's improvement in terms of now having a permanent commissioner who has managed to gather at least 30 staff, possibly heading in the direction of 40. Those people were in there 5 years ago, right? So today there are more hands to prepare the work of the G10 Commission. There are more hands to prepare the work of the Parliamentary Oversight Committee. So all this is good news. And then we have the independent panel in Karlsruhe. At least that's what it's called, right? Some of us may question independence where one of the members is a federal prosecutor. I haven't met the people on this visit, but perhaps I'll meet them next time. And for all I know, they are perfectly independent-minded people and perfectly competent people. I don't know. I can't make a judgment. All I can say is that the way that the law has been written and the way they've been appointed isn't optimal. It doesn't necessarily generate confidence in the system. And what's more, if I read it well, but there should be plenty of lawyers in the room to correct me, the thrust is on what we call a priori authorization, ex ante authorization of requests for surveillance. So my question is, who does ex post? Now, my job over the past 2 weeks has been made more complicated by the fact that Germany has a federal system, which of course means that at the end of 2 weeks, my question keeps on. If I were a German citizen with a German passport in my pocket, would I be worried about something slipping through the cracks? And that to me is perhaps my greatest worry. And since I only have time to speak about my greatest worry, let me tell you about it. Having spent 75 minutes praising the German system and saying how good you are. My greatest worry is, are Germans saints? And especially, are all members of the German police and the German intelligence service saints and totally infallible? Or are there a few human beings amongst them? Because, let me tell you a little story. Go on the internet. I will not use the verb Google. You can use Bing, you can use DuckDuckGo, use any search engine you like, and look up Investigatory Powers Tribunal, 23rd July 2018. And what will you read? You can only read this much of a judgment which I suspect is as long as from here to the wall, right? Because much of it is classified. But basically you are seeing a British court telling its equivalent of the BND, though your BND is actually GCHQ plus MI6, and it's actually telling them, you've really pissed me off. You've done nothing but life to me for the past 3 years, 5 years. You've distorted things. You've come back here and changed your testimony so many times. Go away and do something about it. Now, the British are going to have to sort it out. And I ask myself, yes, it's true. The British have a bigger outfit than the Germans. But that doesn't mean that the Germans have a teeny-weeny outfit. The German outfit is, pretty considerable. So, and now we come to the key question. Question 1. Do the British have sinners and the Germans only have saints? Or could there be a few sinners in the German ranks too? And how do we find out about them? How would I, as a German citizen, have confidence of one thing? So let me share something which I meet in many countries. When I go to many countries and I ask them, so hey, what are you doing? Ireland, Sweden, the United States, France, Germany. And a lot of systems that exist for monitoring surveillance are what I would call paper trails. So you go along. Yes, they do it seriously. I am not mocking this, don't get me wrong. They do it very seriously. Most of the people you have working in the secret services in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in France, are actually very good people. They're actually people who believe in the job they're doing, and they actually are people who are trying to protect the state. I have absolutely no doubt about that. The problem, of course, is human nature. And when you check and you look at where do data breaches come from, whether it's the police or a bank, and of course even the secret services, does anybody remember where Edward Snowden worked? 94, 97%, depends on the country, are insider jobs. Because it's the insiders who have the access that can matter. And now I'm going to ask you a question. So, would you be surprised if you were to know that the control authorities in France, in the Netherlands, in Norway, in Switzerland, have a direct access and an electronic interface into the databases of their secret services and police forces? And why is that? So they'll be able to go in and check without necessarily, hello, can I come in? Right? And this is now what I'm going to ask you. So if I were a German citizen, and you know how complex Germany is, because we have data protection commissioners with rights of oversight at state level, 16 of them. We have a data protection commissioner at federal level. We have the G10, we have the independent panel. We have the PCC, we have the permanent commissioner. But now ask yourself the question, where will I find a secure room with access to the databases of the secret services? Not only that, how many techies do I have in the room? Come on, forget the lawyers. You know, the first thing we do, remember Henry V, the first thing we do is shoot all the lawyers. He didn't say shoot, he said kill. But do I have any techies in the room? Come on, please don't leave me alone. Nobody who knows how to code in Java, who could tear a piece of Unix to bits? One, good. You know what this feels like? This feels like your typical data protection authority. Bunches of lawyers, and to find a techie, you have to go out with a Geiger counter. Now ask yourself, now just imagine, if somebody gave Nora and myself the right and told us, okay, you're going to be the king and queen of data protection in Germany. This is the new Bundesdatenschutzgesetz. This is the new amendment to the German constitution. Not only do we have Persönlichkeitsrecht, not only do we have a whole bunch of rights, but now we have a king and queen only for data protection and privacy, and you have the right to go anywhere and check on anything, whenever you like, without giving anybody prior notice, just to keep them on their toes. And let's assume that Nora and myself were both lawyers. Well, we can assume that we are both lawyers too. Could we do that without techies? Could we do that without being able to go in somewhere and having a whole bunch, 6, 10, 20, depending on the size of the task, and finding out one thing? And I'm going to take you back to the paper trail. What is the paper trail? So the paper trail is, just imagine Jeanette being a member of the Secret Services, a senior ranking member, part of their legal staff. They have lots of legal stuff. And she comes along, she goes to Ulf, because Ulf is part of the oversight authority, and she gives him the papers. And the papers say, I want to carry out this task, whether it's bulk operations, whether it's targeted surveillance. And she says, this is why I think this action is proportionate. This is why I think this action is necessary in a democratic society. She's right. Ulf says yes. She goes away. But what happens if the Secret Service or police force that Jeanette is representing is not telling the whole truth? What happens if there are a bunch of requests which don't go through, but which are simply done? Does anybody remember the BND before June 2013? On the planet I lived, that BND had a data protection officer who did not know what the BND was doing. So hang on a bit. Perhaps we should be learning something here. And this is where I close my first intervention. Because following a paper trail is good and necessary, but it can't be the only part of oversight. Going on scheduled inspections is good and necessary, but it can't be the only part of oversight. Because if it's the only part of oversight, then you are completely dependent on what they're telling you. Ulf would be completely dependent on what Jeanette is telling him. And what we would need, I say, is the ability of an independent, competent, well-resourced authority, an authority with techies, an authority with lawyers, an authority with thieves. What do I mean by thieves? I mean, in the nicest way possible, it takes a thief to catch a thief. So I would include, therefore, with the good guys, because most of them are good, ex-police people, ex-intelligence people, because they need to know what they're looking for. And when I have teams made up in this composite way, ex-police people, ex-intelligence people, senior lawyers, and bunches of good techies, and I can go and check that not the ex-ante, the paper trail authorization was right, but that I can go ex-post and check whenever I like, both physically by going to the machines and going in and checking the code, but also externally, through external interface from a secure room inside the Data Protection Authority, inside the Oversight Authority, whichever it is. That's when I would feel most comfortable, because then my security services, my domestic security, my foreign intelligence, my police forces, that way they know that any time they risk having an inspection. And now is my final question. I'm awarding a prize to whoever manages to find in Germany that kind of outfit. When you find those techies, when you find those facilities, the technical facilities, the setup, the ability to do it, and do it on a regular basis, I am going to award a prize which I haven't decided yet, but you're going to help me decide, right? Because I can't find it. After 2 weeks in Germany, I can't find it, not at the state level, not at the federal level. And I'm giving the German government more time to come and tell me if they have. And the problem is, and this is where it gets interesting, in some areas of German law, it seems as if it can exist. Because some areas of German law, even at state level, grant that power. But now, please go out into the lander. Please go out into the data protection commissioners in the lander and interview them. If you want to join my team, I can't pay you, but I'm certainly happy to have you, right? Go into the lander and ask the data protection commissioners and tell them, how many techies do you have? How many people do you have allocated to oversight of police forces? Number of people allocated to oversight of your intelligence services? Okay. How many of you can tell me how many people there are in the intelligence service of Bavaria? How many of you can tell me how many people there are in the intelligence service of North Rhine-Westphalia? Okay. It's in 3 figures. Sometimes in the higher 3 figures, sometimes in the lower 3 figures. Do you know how many people the Data Protection Commissioner of Bavaria has dedicated to that? And do you know how many people the Commissioner of North Rhine-Westphalia has dedicated to that? Right? It is in the single figures. Sometimes it is the single figure. Sometimes it's 0.5, depending which land you are looking at. And that's the worry. And that 0.5 is either 0.5 of a lawyer or 0.5 of a techie, but it's 0.5 of a human being who's supposed to be working 40 hours a week and not trying to make sure that their data protection commissioner is being told the truth. I could go on for hours, and I want to stop here because I'm just making friends with Nora, and I want to stay friends with her. But that's a flavor of what I wanted to tell you today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for being so good about the time. So let's get another perspective from Germany. Ulf is going to maybe look at the things that don't work so well from a litigation perspective and sort of maybe point us to a few things that are not working so well yet in addition to this.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. Does this work, actually? Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, thank you, Joe, for joining us tonight, and thank you also for having a look at the situation of privacy in Germany for about 2 weeks. But I think it's very important that you come here, but I assume that you did not only come to make GFF's people happy, but that there is a deeper reason behind your visit. And I'd like to take a step back from the many details that you presented already and ask myself and ourselves the question, why is privacy in Germany so important, even from an international perspective? Because, of course, you're not the Data Protection Commissioner of Germany, but you bring to the table the perspective of international law of the United Nations. And I think you are doing right, not only for Germany, but also in order to safeguard privacy on an international level. So if you ask Americans, is there any importance in privacy in Germany? Many will tell you, yes, of course. Because Congress is never going to enact any law that substantially safeguards privacy. Of course, they will not go on the record, but if you close the doors, many Americans will tell you that, including American public officials. And this, I think, highlights that we are in a very special position in Germany. We are probably not Candyland when it comes to privacy, but we still have a pretty good situation when it comes to privacy. You made that pretty clear in your opening statement. And also we have a litigation system, a court system, primarily the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, that has a strong tendency to safeguard privacy and to set standards that have a chance to spill over to other European countries, but also to the United States. If you look at the the General Data Protection Regulation that just came into power earlier this year, it is largely influenced by German privacy thinking, at least, for better or worse. Of course, there are also downsides, but still there is some sort of regulation that came into power all over Europe, and we already see that this regulation has a strong influence on what American internet companies tend to do. Because, of course, if they want to do business in Europe, they have to adapt their business practices, and they also face questions from US users, because nobody understands why Europeans would be better protected than, for example, Americans or Canadians or Mexicans or Japanese people. So the spillover effect actually works. And this is one of the many reasons why GFF decided to set up a strong framework, a strong organization for strategic litigation in Germany, but also with the situation of human rights on a global scale, and of course in particular in Europe. Let me just give you a very brief overview of the cases we brought to the courts in recent years, in part together with Reporters Without Borders, something that Christian is going to talk about later maybe, but some together with Amnesty International, just in order to give you an idea what we can do in Germany in order to support and strengthen privacy worldwide. The two cases that I have to mention first and foremost are the cases that we call G10 and BND law. So that's two constitutional complaints that we brought before the court in Karlsruhe, directly challenging two laws. The G10, which is one law that authorizes the Federal Intelligence Service, BND, to wiretap internet communications without any suspicion. And that is important because it is the same type of bulk collection, at least generally speaking, that the NSA does, and that caused most outcries when Edward Snowden revealed what the NSA actually does, in cooperation with the GCHQ in the United Kingdom. So G10 authorizes bulk collection of internet traffic, and the same is true for the BND law. And we at GFF hold that bulk collection without any suspicion is generally incompatible with human rights, because we hold that if some federal agency in Germany has the right to snoop on any internet communications just by wiretapping, for example, the DKIX, so the worldwide largest internet exchange point in Frankfurt, then there is no privacy on the internet. You know, if you have some snoops who can just copy any data that passes through DKIX in Frankfurt, then there is no privacy on the internet. Of course, they may not store this data forever. They have to adapt filtering techniques to this data, so they can't just put it on a hard drive. They have to look at it right away. But, you know, I think Joe made a pretty interesting point here. They are not all saints. You know, they're not all sinners, but they're not all saints at the BND. And we just don't know what happens to this data once it's copied. So we hold it's a problem in itself if all data can be copied, and we strongly argue in favor of targeted collection. So if there's someone who is, for example, a suspect of a crime, then we don't have a general problem with some sort of data collection about this suspect, right? But it's a problem if anyone, including journalists, for example, including whistleblowers, face bulk collection of their internet communications, and there's only one, at least at this point in time, only one remedy, and that is encryption and technology. And me being a lawyer, I hold this to be a very deplorable situation, because normally it should be human rights, it should be basic rights that limit what authorities can do. But what we see today is there's only one way, and that's mathematics, right? If there's some sort of prime mathematics, which is the underlying technology of PGP, for example, that can't be broken, then that's the only way to really protect your data. And I think this is really sad that we as societies don't get to pass laws that protect our privacy. Only mathematicians can protect us from snoops at this point. I think this is really sad. Okay, but don't let me talk about that too long. Let me just quote two other cases that we think are really important for privacy. One is the case that we just brought a couple of weeks ago against state-sponsored malware. We call it the Staatstrojaner case, so the case against the authorization in the criminal code of criminal procedure that agencies may use state-sponsored malware in order to hack computers, to do wiretaps, or to search computers remotely. We think that that's a problem from a human rights perspective because there are no strong safeguards in place in order to assure IT security, which is a problem because just in order to be able to hack some suspects, millions of people in this country, but also worldwide, have IT systems that are much less secure than they should be. We think that's just not proportionate. Another case that we also brought together with Christian and Reporters Without Borders is the case that we call Datenhehlerei, so basically trafficking in stolen data. There's a new provision in the German criminal code that makes it a crime to acquire or to pass over or pass on data that has been stolen by someone, which may make sense when you think of stolen credit card data. But when this data is actually, for example, leaked PDF files that make clear that there has been a crime in a federal agency, then that's a problem, of course, because this PDF file is stolen data. And to pass it on to a journalist, or if you're a journalist, to pass it on to some IT expert for analysis makes you susceptible to criminal investigations, which, of course, is just unthinkable, and it's really flaw in German law because that's not a strong whistleblower protection, and this is why we challenge this law as well. So that's just a brief outline of a few cases that we've been bringing in order to protect human rights and privacy in particular. Maybe I just pass on the microphone to Nora again in order to open the discussion. Oh no, to give the word to. Well, we'll see. Nora, okay. Surprise us.
I got you covered. So thank you very much. That's a brief overview, maybe over another few points that we can talk about. But there's one thing that we haven't really mentioned yet, and I want to ask Jeanette Othman about this. So you gave an interview in April highlighting the challenges for individual users on social media, and you said we need to have collective solutions. Where do you see the challenges for the legislator in that area?
I guess I have one. Sorry, it's just buried under my stuff here. I guess I have a principal problem with what Ulf called privacy thinking in many ways. Because it's true, it's a German success. We came up with this idea and put it into laws. But the sort of, let's say, older generation of data protectionists is sort of unable to question principles that made a lot of sense in the 70s, but perhaps not so much now anymore. And one of the issues I have concerns the fact that we think of human and citizen rights always, not always, but most of the time in individual terms. And that is really for me embodied in this idea of informed consent. You individually have the right to decide whether you want to get into this deal that you give your private data in exchange for a service. And no matter whether that is really the freedom you have, you might even be forced to use a certain service, a private service, you are being held responsible for whatever third parties do with your data. And I think it's too much for the individual to make that choice on a daily basis, 100 and 200 times again and again and again. I think we need sort of collective rules that take some of the responsibility that the individual has. Not only because I think it's too much for an individual to decide that all the time, but also because of the power asymmetry in this constellation between, say, the big social networks and us as individuals. We only have the freedom to say no, but we cannot ask them to change their terms of service in a way that we find it more suitable than it is at the moment. We would have to organize as individual users to actually force these companies to change their terms of service and perhaps come up with a different business model. So that's what I mean. Individual users would have to sort of exert collective power. And for that, we should have organizations who do that on our behalf. We would need, let's say, consumer protectionist agencies or something like that. A bit like an equivalent to what we had in the industrial age with unions. They would act on behalf of individual workers. And we need that kind of institution for users vis-à-vis the big companies. So that was my point, that I think, of course, it's good that human rights protect the individual, but some of the rights are not well protected if we can take care of these rights only on an individual basis. But if I may, I would like to actually comment on one expression that you both used about saints and sinners. I think that is, I say that from a social scientist perspective. I'm not quite happy with that kind of expression. I would say what we see here, actually, because of Edward Snowden, we got so much data that showed us that intelligence services today form a culture, a transnational culture that often makes them feel more at home with their fellows in other countries, where they share certain ideas of what risks are and what the constraints are in their sort of respective nation states, and what a bother it is that the government permanently wants to control them and doesn't allow them to use all the data they could have access to if, etc., etc. So it's a culture that is very strong, and it seems to unify all intelligence services, at least in Europe, but probably actually also in a transatlantic way. So what they have is this idea of that they need to have access to all the data. And we know, because of Snowden, that they were also exchanging them. If they were not allowed to collect data domestically, then they would get them from their fellow agencies. So they did this all the time. And that is sort of not a matter of being a saint, but rather of sharing a certain culture that might be so strong that it informs the behavior of agencies no matter what the national law says. So that is one thing I wanted to say, that they will always look for holes in the legislation and in the control system to actually get what they think is their right to have. We know this from the German discussion. They have their own lawyers, as you know, right, in this debate about should they be able to collect data of foreigners, yes or no. And they are very convinced of this, and that isn't even captured in a matter of is this legal or not. They're convinced that they should have these data, and they share this with their colleagues and other countries.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about sort of the risks for individuals, but I want to turn to you, Christian. What does privacy mean for the freedom of the press? This is a topic that you're very fired up about. Which risks do these data exchanges, data collections, and so on pose for maybe protection of sources, protection of journalists themselves?
Well, I mean, I could start from a very global perspective, being at a global organization, coming to the situation in Germany and why an organization like Reporters Without Borders deals with the issue of privacy. And there I will just give you a figure which I think underlined very much why this is important. Reporters Without Borders is doing lots of advocacy work globally, but as well we do practical assistance to journalists in need. We give legal assistance, we give assistance to families and so on and so forth, to people who have been tortured, who had to leave their country. And I think we did 3 years ago an internal survey of all the assistance cases we had globally, assistance cases from all over the world, from Syria to Bahrain, from all over the world. And we found out that actually more than 50% of the cases who we gave practical assistance, who we helped with very different means, got in situations of trouble. They needed our assistance as a consequence of surveillance, so for violation of really violating their individual privacy. People have been tortured, had to leave their countries, have been imprisoned because they have been surveyed. And I think this is gives you as a figure maybe an idea why we deal with it and why it's on a very individual level violating journalistic rights. But on a policy level, on a practical level, coming back to Germany, and I think that's why we are talking here, I think what is a risk to press freedom? I think that still lots of journalists who really have to rely on protection of sources still only see privacy maybe as a professional obligation, but not as a right. I was in Nuremberg the other day on Tuesday for a discussion with local journalists, and I think really nobody sees privacy, right to privacy, really as a right they have. It's a professional obligation, but not even this. And I think if we start talking about risks, and that's what you wanted to ask me a bit about, is actually I think a major risk is still that lots of journalists who we deal in Germany don't see actually violation of privacy as a risk to journalism. I think this is a problem because it's in the end it's somehow irresponsible, and this is still and there's still lots of people don't understand actually why protection of sources is so important. And protection of sources is important because in the end sources have to rely on that the secrets they hand over to journalists stay secret. And there I can tell you, unfortunately, several examples which I don't make here public in terms of names of people of journalists somehow even who violated these rights of the sources. And I think that's why we have to deal with it and to understand this. But coming back to Germany as well, the very much fact that Joe is sitting here is actually, I'm happy that you're here, but I think we have to overcome as well in the German policy field the contradictions which we have. I think you talked about lots of good things which we have in Germany, and we have the rule of law, and this is something which I always highlight globally when I'm traveling all over the world, that this is something which we really have in Germany where we can rely on. But the very much fact that your job exists is somehow we have to be grateful to Germany and Brazil because they committed very much for your job. But I would say the whole existence of your job somehow was a distraction maneuver from the very much fact that we have lots of violations of the right to privacy in Germany. You mentioned some of them and some of the contradictions. And I think we have to overcome as well as a violation of press freedom as well this contradiction in the German policy field. And I remember 2 years ago when the new BND law, which we are filing the complaint together, we did a lot of advocacy with politicians, with MPs in parliament, and this brings me very much to what you mentioned about the lack of technical capability. most of the people we talk to actually say they really when we talked with our technical expert doing advocacy work on this about technical issue of surveillance, I think most of the people in having power and who in parliament and in ministries, they really lack this technical ability to understand the problems, and I think this is something which I see as well as a threat to press freedom, bringing me to the very much fact which you said, Jeanette, because the logics of how to deal with privacy today is sometimes still a very, I would say, you mentioned as well the Volkszählung, the census issue, some in the 80s, I think it was in 83, I think it's very much determined by this census in the 83, the way how data and privacy today is managed. And I think this I see as a major threat.
Thank you. Before I open it up for your questions, let me turn to you, Joe Cannataci, with one more question. Jeanette Othman has made a case for the need for a global regulation, really, because if we, tie the hands of our surveillance agencies, then they'll just get the data from somebody else, or they'll sort of talk about it together. And you've sort of come forward with a suggestion, namely an international data access agency. How was that proposal received? Oh, maybe you can explain it briefly, but also how was this proposal received and what are the next steps?
Okay. I mean, there's been so much being said that, if you don't mind, Nora, I'll add some context. Firstly, I have openly spoken about my preference for having bulk acquisition of data being outlawed, except in those cases where it can be proven to be necessary. And I think that what you have to look at the context is the decision, especially of the 13th of September, in the case Big Brother and others against the United Kingdom, where the European Court of Human Rights has said something which I will openly say I have agreed with, which actually I've been agreeing with for 3 years before they said it, which is bulk acquisition is not incompatible with human rights standards, provided that it meets the tests of necessity, proportionality, and that the law has provided the right safeguards. And why did it find the United Kingdom at fault in that case? Because it did not provide the right safeguards. And it went into a certain level of detail. And one really great thing which has happened in Germany over literally the past 24 hours is that, and you have something to be proud of, a German foundation, the Stiftung, oh God, okay. There you are. Thank you, Johannes. Has produced this book. Thank you, that was good. I can wave it around. Because basically they have come to the conclusion that I had, which is that bulk acquisition is here to stay. So might as well come up with safe practices for trying to keep it in check. And here you have 64 good practices for trying to keep it in check. And these are the kinds of things that the European Court of Human Rights is rightly looking for, right? Because, yes, and you have to understand my situation. When I speak to secret services and police, I sound as if I'm advocating for NGOs. But when I speak to NGOs, sometimes it seems as if I am advocating for and being, the advocatus diabolos for the police, because as a techie, I can see a number of situations where the necessary thing is to use bulk acquisition, right? But not bulk acquisition without, one, bulk acquisition should not be the order of the day. It should not be the new normal, and I want to see the safeguards. So that's one thing which I wanted to put at stake. Secondly, and I think it's a very important context before I get back to what Nora was asking me directly, is what you were saying, Jeanette. I'm not in the least surprised that the intelligence people form a fraternity. Because this is human nature. Come with me to a police meeting internationally, it's a fraternity. But come with me to doctors internationally, it's a fraternity. Lawyers, it's a fraternity. So many professions internationally think in one way. It doesn't mean necessarily that they give themselves more rights. Actually, one of the good things you have in Germany is that you have the current generation of police people and intelligence people, they've been brought up in a way where, data protection and privacy and proportionality is actually drilled into them from the very first day. You are so lucky. You have to come and see some of the countries I visit, right? So that is very good. Does that mean that there won't be a minority who will breach those sacred principles? Yes. And that is why I use the terminology, okay, fine. I mean, I'll admit, I come from a Catholic country, so I'm using sinners and saints. So, but find me another terminology, I don't care. But the important thing is human nature. That's what I'm going for here. And human nature expressed in whatever way. What does human nature do? Human nature also plays politics. So to come to the question that Nora posed me, yes, for 2.5 years, my research teams and myself have worked on developing something which you can easily download on the internet, which is a draft legal instrument on surveillance in cyberspace. Now, how many lawyers do we have in the room, or would-be lawyers? Okay, there you are. Now, if there's one lawyer in the room, or indeed on the planet, who can find me a solution to the problem of jurisdiction in cyberspace, man, would I be happy, right? Because there isn't. Because we haven't agreed that. In the same way as we haven't agreed solutions for espionage at international law. And because of this key problem, and remember how international law works. So it took us 27 years to develop the international law of the sea, where borders vow, what happens. It took us so many years to come up with the law on international space, on space out there, outer space, inner space. It took us so many years to come up with the international law on copyright, right? Largely thanks to the objections of the United States from the Berne Convention of the 1800s to the UCC of 1966, it took us almost 100 years, right? So international law takes a long time to establish, which is why I never said that we should immediately go for a multilateral treaty, not that it's not needed, but I know a few things about political will. Right, so this is what, my 34th, my 35th year now of dealing with governments and ambassadors and trying to put together international law on the subject. The truth is, at this moment in time, there is no political will, not in Europe, not outside Europe, to agree to a binding multilateral instrument. There is a need for it. The need is one thing. Do the politicians want to do it? No. Why? Because there's a lot of problems in getting agreement of any sort in cyberspace at the international level. We can't even do it on things which appear to be, to the politicians, more fundamental, like international humanitarian law in cyberspace, critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, cyber war. We haven't sorted those out at the international level. We basically have two blocks. The Western bloc with Germany, France, the United States, Britain, etc. The ex-communist or still communist bloc, China, Russia, Cuba, and others. And therefore, there's still a great difference in vision. And what is the difference in vision? And this is especially relevant in this place as the home of the Internet Institute. The point is that there are a number of countries, certainly more than 82 at the last vote of 193 member states of the UN, who see the Internet as part of a space they want to control and where they want to have sovereignty on. So basically what's happening is, ever since the Treaty of Westphalia and thinking about sovereignty, etc., we have, at best, 19th century concepts of sovereignty being applied to the 21st century reality that is the internet. And because of that, we have a problem on how to regulate it. That problem, I am hoping, can be partially solved in an indirect way. And the indirect way that I am advocating here is, if the countries at the UN don't want to immediately go to, for all their political reasons, good or bad, to an international agreement, then we can have a bottom-up building. And the bottom-up building, when it comes to consensus, you have to understand that treaties don't happen that way. We had a talk earlier this year where colleagues from the UN came along and explained how long it's taken to establish the latest treaties. And it's often 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. That's the standard time. Why? Because you need people from all over the world to do it. And in order to do that, one thing that I'm encouraging is that all those people who have signed Convention 108, the 1981 Data Protection Convention, which has an article on national security, and there are 70 people, 70 countries who meet in order to discuss that in a group, and there are 55 who have ratified the convention. So my current strategy is to get them thinking and talking about the same safeguards that we've put in. And if you download it from the internet, you'll see that's why I've called it a legal instrument, because a legal instrument is something which could start off as soft law and finish off as hard law. And in order for that to happen, you need people to get talking about it, to get discussing it, to get accepting their principles of national law. So if we go from 55 countries to 70 countries and eventually to 90 countries who have brought these principles like ex post, ex ante, proportionality, etc., into their law, then we have a much better way to go forward. And thank you for that, Nora.
Thank you. Yes, quick reaction, but I want you to start thinking about your questions because I'm going to open it up to you in 1 minute.
I just want to underline the importance of soft law as something important for developing the right to privacy, because we have some experience at Reporters Without Borders. We filed several OECD complaints against surveillance technology companies, and the things which we learned out of the OECD complaints, which is actually a soft law mechanism within the framework of the OECD, which is a bit complicated. I don't want to elaborate too much, but this soft law OECD complaints led in the end to a stronger regulation of the export of surveillance technology on the EU level, and as well in the implementation of the Wassenaar arrangement, which you can still criticize and which we still do criticize because it's too weak. But somehow we learned a lot from using soft law mechanisms like the OECD complaints, which led to hard law. And so I just want to underline that it's quite important.
Thank you. As an international lawyer, that's what I like to hear. So we're open for your questions, and I think we'll have a microphone in the audience. Thank you so much. So let me please see your hands if you'd like to ask something or make an intervention, add an aspect that we haven't discussed yet. If not, oh yeah, and please say your names if you do have such a question. So I'll have two questions here. Please start with you. Introduce yourself and ask your question.
My name is Irene Latz, and I have two problems with privacy. The one is what Germany did with...
Louder, please. Sorry, the microphone. You have to talk right into it, otherwise it's not going to come on.
First problem is what Germany did with Edward Snowden. So I do not agree that we have good courts in Germany. We do not have, because otherwise he would live in Berlin. And the second problem I have is the third-party rule. And I learned that France, Netherlands, and two other countries, I think not EU countries, have better control over their secret services than we in Germany have, you found out. France and the Netherlands. Would France and the Netherlands also agree on this third-party rule? Or are they also better than we are in this point?
Brief reaction.
Oh dear, shall I be a lawyer about this and say yes and no? The point is, in some countries, the third-party rule doesn't even rise, right? You have to remember that in some legislatures, they're not even going to bother too much about it. In some others, they are going to insist more on it. You have to remember, too, that France and the Netherlands have both appointed, and especially the Netherlands, an independent oversight agency when it comes to their secret services. And what happens there is that they have raised the question of when data goes across borders as being one of the major problems that they have and that we have. So what I would like to tell you is that the protection of data, which in the intelligence services and law enforcement flows across borders, will actually form the part of a half-day session in the International Intelligence Oversight Forum that I will be organizing once again this year at the end of this month, where the G10 Commission will be, where the French will be, where the Dutch will be. My whole intention, in fact, is there's going to be a speech by a member of the Dutch authority in order to bring this up. Because it's a bit more complicated, right? The third-party rule and what you can say, what you cannot say, etc., is a bit... It's perhaps too complicated for the time I have at my disposal. But I can understand why you would be upset about it, and I can understand why you would think that the Germans are interpreting it too strictly. Don't forget politics, however, right? I mean, if you go to the United States, senators and congressmen in the United States will tell you how pissed off they are at their own intelligence agencies because they don't answer their questions. Right? However, they are much less generous when it comes to any data which goes over, because they will want to know it, right? So the use of the third-party rule in the United States is also an interesting question. But perhaps my colleagues here would want to talk about the third-party rule.
Well, I think you made the important points. I'd just like to comment on the point that we had a problem with German courts, given that Edward Snowden is not living in Berlin. Well, to my knowledge, this case has not been taken to court, because it's actually a problem that the German government wouldn't assure him that he's not going to be extradited to the United States. So the blame is on the German government and not on the courts, at least to my knowledge. Well, anyway, Nora, next questions?
Yeah, we had one more question over here. Thank you.
Before I get to my question, maybe just to add to what Ulf
Brief
just
introduction,
said.
sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Anne Roth. I see that in between the government and the courts, because during the inquiry on the Snowden revelations, we did try to take that to court. And I think it's a bit more complicated than that. To testify in the inquiry.
To testify, but he would have been at liberty to come to Germany. The problem is that the German government wouldn't assure him that he's not going to be taken to the US, right? And that is the problem. That is the problem. So even if the inquiry committee had asked him to testify, he would still have had that issue.
I have the impression that there was also a question there.
Right. I didn't want to get into that. Just saying it's like all of these issues more complicated than that. The question that I wanted to ask, that I actually came here with, and then I was interested to hear you say that you think it's a good thing when there is actually people from the intelligence being in the oversight bodies and the teams of oversight, because they actually know what they're looking for. And my question, to modify that a little bit, is, so do you think there is maybe something like I'm not asking for numbers, but something like a limit of how many people from intelligence should be in those teams? Because when we were in the inquiry on the Snowden revelations in the last years, at some point I'd say some of us were quite surprised to hear that one of the oversight departments in the Chancellery doing the oversight of the BND is actually made up only of people who have a past in the BND also as well. So, and talking about fraternities and like dynamics that evolve, I was wondering what you like, if you have a view on that, if there is maybe something like a healthy limit.
I think that if you're going to go by the way, if you look at the work they have to do, the limit comes out on itself. And I certainly wouldn't think that roughly, right? You need more than a third of your staff to have had either law enforcement experience or intelligence experience. Sometimes all you need is 2 or 3 or 4 people on a large team in order to be able to guide you. But I don't want, and remember, normally the way these things go, it would be best always to see people go in 3s or 4s, right? So you have a techie, you have a lawyer, you have an ex-practitioner so that they know what to look for. That being said, you have to tailor it to the situation, right? What I don't want to hear is things which have been told to me privately, in confidence, by members of the German Secret Services, which are, what's the use of the G10 Commission? They don't know what to look for, right? And that is what I don't want to hear. And in order not to hear that, I need to have the practitioners there. They don't need to dominate, right? But their insights are essential, and they're also essential to moderate the discussion.
But would you see there might be a problem because
There might be, but quite frankly, it all depends on the situation. I don't know whether the people I've met at the BND, at the Chancellery, I'm sorry, were all ex-BND people. I do know of some people who have been shipped around from one area to another, and not necessarily to the Chancellery, but to Parliament, to other people, or to other places, because there is this tendency of politicians to think of, shall we call it, a safe pair of hands? And that in some cases they wouldn't want somebody who's going to rock the boat too much, right? So I would look carefully not only at the structures, but the people who feel the structures. I have in mind at least 1 or 2 countries where the law was fantastic, but the people responsible for, they put in judges who were lovely judges. You couldn't say anything against them, but they were too weak. Right? And if you fill the right positions with the wrong people, you are also in the shit, frankly. And you have to therefore be very careful that the structures you set up to choose people are at least as carefully thought out as the laws themselves. Because it's people who are going to put them into practice. And when you look at the laws you have in Germany and how they are set up, you will realize that. My recommendation to you, for example, is have a look at the way the Dutch Oversight Review Committee, as it's called, is set up. And you will see how many safeguards there are in it to include panel of judges recommending people, people from the parties, people from the parliament, people from the executive. There are some countries, typically the Nordic countries, the Netherlands, etc., which get it right more than other countries. And it's sometimes worth looking at the way they put these things together, because it becomes part of the culture. And that is where you could see more trust coming in. I understand the point that you've made, though, about the BND.
Jeanette Othman, you want to jump in?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask a question too, and now you have sort of more than half answered it. I was thinking whether there is anything to learn from other sectors where we find regulatory capture. For example, Germany with the automotive industry, no matter what they do, right? No matter how illegal their behavior is, there's always someone in the government going to protect them. So I was wondering whether, when you are so optimistically say we can solve of this with regulatory oversight, whether we would not have to expect that very same phenomenon, particularly because there is so many revolving door people just moving, switching between government and intelligence services. It's a very, a relatively small community of experts who know each other. You call that fraternity, and that's probably a good expression for this. But it's always the same kind of people who early on move into this area and then sort of climb up the ladder. And these are also then the people one would expect to end up in an oversight position.
Well, I don't know, it's because I was born with the optimism gene, right? But actually, if you look at the way that human beings have worked, it's one which tells you that it's very difficult to get confidence that somebody who's in a secret service won't abuse power, right? Or where their loyalty will lie. And I have seen many cases of governments coming or going and not firing the heads of the Secret Service. Now, in some cases, that could be because the heads of the Secret Services knew some things about them which they didn't want to see come out, right? But in other cases, it's because those people were actually valid people. And therefore, no, I don't think it's impossible to think of a system, especially in a country the size of Germany, to find enough people to properly man the oversight agencies. I will say it's difficult. And in fact, that is why I raised a question to which I don't yet have an answer, which is, if you want to do proper ex-post oversight, are you going to set up 16 other agencies in Germany? Or are you going to set up, or are you going to reinforce the existing agencies? Or are you going to have one agency at the center, and then what's the constitutional problem, center vis-a-vis the lander? So you have a number of those things coming into play, and I think it can be done. I could go into detail, I won't, I have no in mind, but we have to look at the other details, and the devil is in the detail. I can't insist enough. Look at things in detail. The devil is in the detail. And there are issues in the laws, there are issues in the human beings who have to implement them. So even when you look at the composition of the G10, of the institutions that you have, do ask yourself the question, why was this person chosen, right? Sometimes when you meet the politicians themselves, and you ask them to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, you also get insights into that, right? Because happily, there are many politicians who are conscientious. There are some of them who write to me frequently because they are concerned about it. I want them to keep that up. But at the same time, there are some people who shouldn't be in politics at all, but who should be in jail. And frankly, we don't have enough of them in jail. And I'm saying this as a general principle. Come across. There are many countries across Europe where more politicians need to be in jail than in Germany, believe me. But that is the position. And remember, one thing we haven't mentioned so far, what do you think is the greatest concern that I meet when I go across from one country to another? I'm not talking sub-Saharan Africa or Asia here, I'm talking Europe. What do you think the politicians tell me? They tell me, Joe, we want to be sure that our domestic intelligence service is not spying on me. That is their primary concern, right? And that is one of the oversight mechanisms they want to have working, that there is not unwarranted spying on those people. Yet, like the song goes, let me take you by the hand and walk you to the streets of London, but I'm not going to walk you to the streets of London. I could take you into a number of countries around Europe where the politicians are so corrupt that not watching them would be a dereliction of duty on behalf of the Secret Service. So how do you resolve that problem when it comes to oversight and parliamentary oversight?
So we have time for just maybe a couple more questions. Any more questions from the audience? Here's one, and there's one. Thank you. Yeah, maybe we'll collect them and then do a round on the panel to conclude.
Hello, I'm Christoph Hamsen. I think there's an interesting spin to the discussion as to that it needs oversight over the central intelligence agencies and the police, whereas in my understanding, I would more think it's governments going rogue on not trying to execute their control over agencies. Could you comment on that?
And here's another question over here. Sorry, can we move the microphone quickly? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Justas Kidikas from EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. To come with a question, I guess I have to give very little background, is that I myself come from Lithuania. And there, the privacy issue is just, let's say, it's just not a topic, despite the legacy of a Soviet regime. And for me, to this day, it still surprises me how some young people here, or let's say in France, and some other Western European countries, look at the surveillance problem. And because for them, the biggest problem sometimes is not the question if there's enough oversight. It's not the question if there are maybe too many legal loopholes. The question is, or the problem, the biggest issue is that the fact that the government simply has the capacity to surveil the people. So to use the previously used terminology, the government as a subject itself is perceived as a sinner. So from your experience, how difficult it is to have a constructive and fully rational debate on this? And would you see some sort of national legislation or multinational, the one would appease all the parts of society? Thank you.
Any other burning questions in the audience? Now's your chance. There's one more hand over there. Could we just get that question too? Thank you. Oh, there's one more. Okay, keep it short.
Konstantinos Tsekiliotis, I'm a student assistant at the HIC here. I'm interested at the legal instrument you mentioned. Would that be in a process of multi-stakeholderism, in a process of global constitutionalism? How do you achieve legitimacy? Do you have a convention on cybercrime as the Budapest Convention? And if you bring all those people at the table in the first place, so why can you convince them to read something that it's binding? Is it an academic text, like the CLIPS principles? How do you conceive this? Thank you.
Okay, here's a lawyer question, I guess. And one more question over there. And then I guess we're going to have a round of answers. And then I think you're probably all thirsty. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Niels Leopold. I have two questions. My first question would be for Mr. Cannataci. Do you have a favorite on all these German authorities who are overseeing the intelligence agencies? Is there a favorite in your view? Because there are so many that I like to prioritize. And the second question would be maybe to the whole round, complexity in data protection, or first thing that comes to my mind when I think about privacy in Germany in this year, 2018, is complexity. It's become so over complex, and we have all the different topics presented here and with your group here. Like you're working on the data privacy regulation, I guess, or you're confronted with the problems. That's why you talked about consent, which is a totally different area from intelligence laws. Yeah. But intelligence law is also extremely complex, and actually, it's so complex that the folks that you want to install in the authorities probably wouldn't know what to look after because the law doesn't say what they're supposed to look after. So I would just be interested to hear something about that.
Thank you. So for the last round on the panel, I think what we'll do is we'll go around and maybe either give you last or have our host have the concluding statement. You guys figure that out. So maybe we'll start with Ulf and Christian and then go around.
Thanks, Nora. I'd like to start with Niels' last question concerning the multitude of oversight bodies that we have established in Germany. I mean, you were asking which was Joe's favorite, and I would answer you saying that the problems that we have so many, which have different tasks to accomplish that sometimes overlap, but that sometimes also leave a lot of room where basically no oversight is actually being executed. And so one of the first demands from civil society would be combine all these authorities and have one single counterpart to the intelligence services that has a broad authority and that has, for example, as Joe suggested, the right to inspect files and folders and IT systems. That would be a very first step, not to be reliant on papers that agencies provide liberally, but to have an own right of inspection into these agencies. So combine the bodies, make the authority clear, and give them much more authority in order to be spontaneous in checking. And another very important civil society demand in this regard would be think about what intelligence services are responsible to do. Do we really need 17 intelligence services having a look into political extremism? In many countries in this on this planet, there is no single agency looking into political extremism except prosecution, right? Criminal law enforcement. Sometimes maybe we don't even need that at all. Or if we do need domestic intelligence services, maybe we should limit the scope of their work. For example, why do they have to look into cybercrime? I just don't get it. I mean, we have many police forces across the country who are responsible to have a look into cybercrime. Why would you task intelligence services with basically the same job? You can criticize that from a civil society and human rights perspective, but you can also criticize that from a government perspective, because look at cases like Anis Amri, so this terrible attack that was carried out here in the city of Berlin. What we found out is that there have been many flaws committed, but one of the problems in this case was that there were just too many authorities competent in this case. You had dozens of different authorities that were sort of looking into the case, but none was really responsible. Have you heard of any resignation because of this massive failure? I haven't. And the reason is there were just so many authorities that every authority could say, well, we maybe didn't do everything, but there was another one who did it even worse. So even from a security perspective, it's a really bad idea to have many authorities basically doing the same job. And so my civil society claim at this point would be concentration. Concentrate what agencies are responsible to do. Really think about it if we need so many agencies, if we need such broad competences, and of course also concentrate oversight. And that would go into to your question. Of course, you have to limit this or separate this oversight from government, because the way secret services are structured in Germany, they are basically gathering intelligence for the executive branch of government, and so you have to separate agency oversight from the executive branch, because otherwise the executive branch would basically execute oversight over itself. So that is, I think, a basic principle. We have that sort of because the oversight bodies are basically selected by parliament, but of course parliaments also elect governments, or executive branch. So it's not that separated as it might be. So, for example, data protection commissioners could be an answer to that question. Just putting that into the room. Thanks.
Yeah, apart from just subscribing almost everything you did, I just want to add 2 points from our litigation perspective and our litigation experience coming together with your demand of more access to data by the oversight bodies. Because what we had in our litigation experience, we are still filing one complaint against the BND together with the GFF, but we filed another complaint where we have been partly successful. We filed a complaint against so-called VERAS database, a database which is filing, storing metadata, phone metadata. And the BND is not allowed anymore to store this metadata. But a separate part of this complaint, unfortunately, and this brings me to the criticism and to the point, is that actually we had to certify in front of the court that we have been affected by a surveillance. And this is actually the problem, as a secret service is a secret service. And that's why it's called like this. And in all the decisions, not only in our case, and there have been several other cases by civil society organizations which have been brought to court, they all made the same experience and they all got the same answer by the courts in the end. Yeah, but you have to certify, you have to guarantee that you have been surveyed. But come on, how we should guarantee this if the Secret Service is a secret service and if even the authorities don't have access to data. So one demand would be first, and this is subscribing what Joe said, that we need more access of data by the authorities, but as well we have to overcome this thinking, I mean, in the courts, that you controlling, if you're litigating against foreign intelligence service, that you always have to certify, to guarantee of being affected. That's why we brought this case, one case which we lost both in the administrative court in Leipzig and which we tried to bring to the Constitutional Court in Leipzig, to the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe. We brought this case now to the European Constitutional Court of Human Rights because we think we have to find a legal way that not only being affected is the only answer for controlling legally secret service. And I think this brings me very much together with the ask for demanding more access and with the need for more concentrated oversight. And just one point, one addition to what Ulf said, it's not only a question of complexity. I think it's sometimes what I know from the oversight bodies, it's sometimes even a question of competition. And I think if all the secret services should serve democracy, which you from time to time can doubt, but I mean, it should not be a question of competition, but I mean all serving for the same cause.
Thank you. So, who's going first? Jeanette, thank you.
I wanted to comment on the question of complexity. I like to compare the situation where we are right now with regard to data to those of the early days of social security systems. From today's perspective, certainly a very complex system, being different in every year, in every country, and covering so many different areas from pension to health insurance and I don't know what. And it took a long, long time to build this. And my prediction would be that data protection in the long run will be just one building block in a much bigger regime covering access to data, use of data, ownership, property rights in data. They are probably coming, at least in the industrial area. So there will be many, many areas, and this will sort of take a long time to build this. So I don't think that complexity is something. No, let's put it differently. I think that complexity is something we will have to learn to deal with. This won't go away. So that's one point I wanted to make. And the other one concerns the question of who would be the actors and would that be something for a multi-stakeholder process. I've watched moving the multi-stakeholder process moving into internet governance. I've seen it sort of being institutionalized in the Internet Governance Forum, and I've seen it failing many times. I've also done research about it and came to the conclusion that we nowadays tend to overestimate this approach as a sort of path towards democratizing the global sphere. But I would also say that there is probably no alternative to it. You won't get to a convention about data without pressure from the people who are affected by this. Government need to see and need to feel this. And these kind of processes of developing a new convention, they become nodes in networks where people meet and where also people from public authorities meet the people of the civil society of their respective countries. And that is a good thing, even if I don't think it will rescue us, the multi-stakeholder approach.
Thank you. Joe, you have the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Dig me in the ribs when it's time for drinks. It's a terrible situation to be the last person between yourself and the drinks.
Say some more, don't worry.
Oh, that's great. It's her fault. Where do I start? Very quickly. I agree 100% with Jeanette. she said a lot of what I wanted to say. I'll just add some things about multi-stakeholderism, for example, right? We cannot do without it, and it's an essential building block. It would be foolish to think that we can do it with multi-stakeholderism alone. In fact, to my mind at least, the Internet Governance Forum is a very important place where no governance takes place. Because governance is not that. Governance is not a talk shop. You need a talk shop, but you need to govern. And the duty to govern is the people we elect. And the people we elect are currently divided. So it is our job as people who live in democracies to persuade the people that we elect that they have to do something about it. And remember, in the end, what matters to most people are jobs, the economy, education, and health, right? Now, once you move beyond that, ask yourself the question that I ask people, and the issue is, are there votes on privacy? Only for a very minority of people. And that's why we have to realize that it's not only the law that we need to fix, because what do we have here? Privacy in Germany, and is privacy at risk. But is privacy at risk principally because of the surveillance, because of the intelligence agencies? My answer would be no. Let me say something which may sound strange to you. The Bundeskriminalamt are not the bad guys. The National Intelligence, the Domestic Intelligence Service are not the bad guys. The BND are not the bad guys. Most of them are good guys. The systems I want in them are to make sure that any bad eggs, and human nature will mean that there will be some bad eggs, I want to find them, root them out, and put them in jail. But that being said, this is where, I would disagree slightly on the issue of cybersecurity, right? I can understand why there is a blurring of lines when it comes to cybersecurity. Because, once again, come with me and I'll show you a few countries where you think you are looking out for terrorism, but that terrorism is being funded by organized crime. So I'm sniffing around the internet to catch out for organized crime, but that very same money, and sometimes the very same people, are the ones wielding the guns, the explosives, etc. So we have to be careful on the cybersecurity thing. I constantly insist with the governments that they have to talk to me about cybersecurity, because it is in the name of cybersecurity that they are carrying out surveillance on each and every one of us. And that is why we have to get it right. But we have to be careful that we don't oversimplify matters. Do I have a favorite oversight agency? I think the correct answer is I love them all. Because, frankly, they all have good points. They're all trying to do something well. The problem is, once I had a German girlfriend who told me something about the German way of thinking, right? And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, because I want to keep all my German friends. But, sometimes if you think too much inside your own box, and you say, no, it's not my job, it's her job. And she says, no, it's not my job, it's her job. Because according to our piece of law, I've done my little duty, and it's her duty. And this is what I mean about things slipping through the cracks. Because everybody thinks that they're doing what they can with the resources they can to the best of their ability and inside the law, and they have confidence in the people they meet. But in actual reality, the central, and this is where, I'm agreeing with Ulf, do you need to have a more focused approach to the oversight of surveillance? Of course you do. At present, it's fragmented. I have no doubt about it, it's fragmented. is it too fragmented? Because perhaps you wanted a little bit fragmented. But is it too fragmented is the question, and do you have, and what are you going to do to remedy it, which is the golden question. Finally, the responsibility when it comes to privacy is with you, with everyone in this room. Because, guys, ladies, gentlemen, you're voting with your fingers many hundreds of times a day. You are keeping the economy going. You are keeping the digital economy going. And it's through your behavior that you can change things. Sometimes the most important thing is not the law, but it's the policy about education. How many people, and this is why, if you ask me why privacy is at risk, I don't think it's because of the BND or because of surveillance. Yes, I want them fixed, and I put my neck on the block to see them fixed. I think that the biggest problem we have is that we have allowed ourselves, and this is not an original expression, we have allowed ourselves to sleepwalk into the surveillance society, where the data that we put out, because it's convenient, because it's nice, because it's good, because it's easy, and the data we're putting largely into the private sector rather than the government sector, that data can be used to profile us. So it's the controls over that data that we need to put in. And more than that, could I remind you one thing? Privacy is a standalone right, it's a fundamental right, but it's only part of a network of rights. It's part of an ecosystem of rights. It's there also as an enabling right. And life wouldn't be worth living if we couldn't have a number of things. And privacy exists to enable that. Privacy exists to enable us to discover who we are, to explore our personalities, to develop our personalities, to explore our sexuality, to explore various dimensions of who we are. And if we can, in order to do that, we have to take conscious decisions. How many people in the room, and I'm not advocating that you do so, don't get me wrong, I'm just asking, how many in the room have consciously ditched Google? Okay. How many in the room, it's a minority, you can see, how many people in the room have consciously switched off a number of convenient things on their phone or on their computer? Except, we do it all the time, but we do it all the time, but do it enough is the issue. And are there enough of us doing it? So basically the first thing that I have been advocating is education, education, education. And let me say so quite freely, I think that, and this is where I link it to democracy, you can't think about privacy and Facebook without thinking about Cambridge Analytica, the Russians, Brexit, and attempts to manipulate us. And we are now at the stage where every click on your phone could be used to manipulate you, to manipulate your commercial decisions, to manipulate your political decisions. And that's part of what privacy is all about, right? Because the more information you give away, the more manipulable you become. And your rights shrink in direct proportion. So I would suggest that we have many more of these discussions, possibly more in depth on each subject, because each one of these subjects need to be brought together in order that, you know, in 20 years' time, we can meet here and be happy that we've managed to find a solution to the many problems we have. Thank you.
Thank you. And your call for education, education, education brings me to one thing that I want to mention before we break up. It's the next event in the lecture series, Making Sense of Digital Society. It's going to be on increasing datification of society and the phenomena of data colonialism. Nick Coldry is a sociologist from LSE, London School of Economics, and he'll be here in the auditorium around the corner on Friedrichstraße on the 20th of November. So please come again to HIC for their next event. And before I invite you to stay for a glass of wine or a juice or whatever, please join me in thanking our fantastic guests for this really exciting evening. And thank you for making time. And have a great night. Thank you very much.